Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. I appreciate it. You may have already installed Home Assistant, or you want to learn how to install Home Assistant securely from start to finish. There are a ton of tutorials out there installing a Home Assistant Docker container or a Raspberry Pi that you can access internally from your network. And it might look something like my screen here. And as you can see, I have a domain name here, and it is videos might be a little bit longer because it is, again, end to end. Not a quick 5-minute video, might be 10-15 minutes long. I hate to say maybe even 20 minutes. But it's all of the steps configuring Home Assistant with a PFSense for my router and firewall, ACME certificates. I use Cloudflare for DNS and dynamic DNS, and obviously Home Assistant, and I'm installing Home Assistant on Docker. Now I'm assuming that you've already set up PFSense, you've already set up ACME certificates, you've already set up a Docker host, and probably a couple other things that I'm missing off the top of my head. And I could create videos on those if there's interest, but I think, at least from the Home Assistant point of view, getting it configured and set up and accessible from inside the network, as well as possibly if you want it outside of your network, we are going to cover that now. So the first thing we're going to do is install Home Assistant on a Docker host. So I already have a Docker host set up within my VMware environment. You can see right here, Docker HA-demo. I have an IP address of 192.168.1.58, just assigned by DHCP, a temporary address on my local network. So quickly, I'm going to pull up PuTTY, new PuTTY window. We're going to type in that I just pasted it in that IP address. Click OK, open that. We're going to log in. Okay, so now we are logged in. So from here, I'm assuming that you have both Docker installed and Docker Compose. I'll be using Docker Compose. There's two ways to execute this. If I go back to the Home Assistant documentation, you can use just the Docker run command, which does work well. I've used it many times. You have to remember it. You have to document it somewhere. You have to save your configuration, right? If you want to go back and update it or move it to a different Docker host, you have to save this, right? So that's what's nice about Docker Compose. So I'm literally just going to take this text right here and I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back to my Docker host. CD/, that takes me to root, and I'm going to create a couple directories. So actually the first thing I'm going to do is sudo -i. So this just saves me a couple of keystrokes later on where I don't have to continue to enter sudo over and over again. Okay, so what I want to do is make a couple directories. There we go. Okay, so now what we can do is we can do a VI or a nano, whichever you want. I use VI. We can do docker-compose.yaml. Perfect. Let's do an I for insert, a right click for paste. There we go. Okay, so container name is Home Assistant, path to your config. So we're going to set this as, so this is a mapping of a host directory to a container directory. Now the host directory is docker/Home Assistant, the one I just created, right? And inside the container it's config. You don't have to touch inside the container. What you have to update is outside of the container, or sorry, the actual host itself. And that's going to be docker/Home Assistant. Network mode host, okay. This all looks good. So I'm going to do an escape, and I'm going to do a :WQ, hit enter, hit ls. Okay, so we have our docker-compose.yaml. So now what we're going to do is, I went back to the documentation, we're going to copy this Docker Compose up -d. So I have not pulled these container layers. So you can see it's doing that now. Okay, Home Assistant is now installed and running. So what we can do, if we come back to Chrome, 168.1.58, port 8123, there we go. So Home Assistant is now installed and running on this Docker host. So now what we can do is we can just put in some test information. So Adam test for video, my username, test user 1, create account. English, time zone, I am on the East Coast, so love to live in Amsterdam. Click next. You can turn these on or turn them off if you would like. Tutorial. So if I found some things on my local network, we'll do that later. Okay, so Home Assistant is installed. So that was the quick part. Now, how do we actually make this secure? So as you can see, we have an IP address here. You can say it's not secure. And then possibly, how do we get this to be accessible outside of our network? Okay, so a few things. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to PFSense, which is my router, firewall, certificate, etc. appliance. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay, so during this part, I will probably use a lot of static images, only because I'm smart enough to know that there are very dangerous people out there that if they want to be malicious, they can. I'm not at all implying that I'm important enough to be a target, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. If you see the screen not moving, it's because I'm using a static image, but I will talk through the process of how to make all of this work. So from the main PFSense screen, you're going to click Services, then you're going to click ACME Certificates, and that will bring you to the certificates screen. You're going to want to add a new certificate. We're going to click under Certificates, we're going to click Add, and it's going to look like this screen here. So we're going to do Test HA Cert for video, and the ACME account is going to be home. It's going to be our testing. This is my nomenclature. The domain name is going to be hatest.cloudautomation.blog. And then this is where you can change it up based on your configuration. For some of my configurations, I have DNS manual because my primary DNS register does not support auto renewing of certificates. So what this process does right here is it auto renews based on a challenge token. Really nice is PFSense and HA got together, and you can enter your information. Right, for this one, I'm going to be using Cloudflare. Cloudflare, you would type your API key, you get it from your dash.cloudflare.com, but you go up to your profile at the top right, you click My Profile, you go over to API Tokens, you then get your global API key, you can click View here. You then have to create a token, you do Edit DNS Zone, select under Zone Resources, you'd select which domain you want this to be able to edit. You'd then go Continue to Summary and then create your token and save that for later. Paste that into Notepad as your DNS token. That token would then go back into PFSense. Under the Cloudflare API token, your account ID and your zone ID are on your main profile page. So go back to Cloud Automation. Right here in the bottom here is your zone ID and account ID. And that's where you'd paste account ID and zone ID respectively into there. And then you'd click Save. I already have one created, a copy certificate. So what I can do is this bottom one, I can click Copy. It will take my information that I pasted already, my API key, my global API key, my account hash, all of that, and it will populate it automatically. Now, one thing that I want to call out is I would always use testing to start. You only get like 5 certs issued from your production account per subdomain or domain every like 60 days or something like that. Essentially, you don't want to test on Let's Encrypt's production infrastructure. That's why they provide a test infrastructure. So use testing first. Over here, I've copied it. I want to call this HA Test Cert 1 description. Let's just copy paste that. Again, this is testing. I want to update my domain name here to HA Test using Cloudflare. Click Save. What we need to do is we need to issue and renew the cert. However, we need to go to Cloudflare, your account, you go to websites, you go to add site, add your site here. So whatever site you want to add, and you have to go through a verification process just to make sure. I don't know exactly what Cloudflare does in the background, but for mine, it took mine about 10-15 minutes. And verified it. I then had to go to my registrar and update the DNS servers. So I took from my existing DNS registrar DNS servers to Cloudflare's DNS servers. Once that was all done, that domain name in Cloudflare, I could then go into DNS. I could then make changes as I needed to within my DNS records. So back to creating that subdomain. So you can see I have a couple here. But what I want to do is I want to click Add Record, and I'm going to call it HA Test. An IP address is going to be 1.1.1.1, and I'm going to off-click Proxy, DNS only. Now, why are we doing this? 1.1.1.1 is Cloudflare's DNS server, and proxy status DNS only. What that's doing is it's essentially passing hatest.cloudautomation.blog to 1.1.1.1 to a DNS server. It's not doing anything essentially, but it's going to set us up properly for dynamic DNS and allowing Cloudflare to front end my public IP address. So now that, let's click save on this. Wonderful. So you can see here hatest 1.1.1.1 DNS only, reserved IP. Now what we're going to do is go back to PFSense, go over to dynamic DNS, and you're probably not going to have anything in here, or maybe you do, but what you're going to want to do is go to the bottom right, click add, and service type, you're going to do Cloudflare. A v6 is IPv6, we're just doing IPv4 standard. Interface to monitor is our WAN. Our host name is going to be HATest. Domain name is going to be cloudautomation.blog. We want to enable proxy. So we're now using, as this says, Cloudflare Virtual DNS Proxy. So we can route all traffic through their servers. So by default, this is disabled and your real IP is exposed. So we do not want that. We don't want our real IP exposed, and we also want to use Cloudflare services, so this allows us to do that. So what I've done already is I've already created one with those tokens, so I'm just going to copy that, and you can do the same thing if you do. So going back through here, my host name is going to be hatest, enable proxy, my username, my password, click save. Now for some reason on my PFSense, this process does not auto forward. It actually, I think I get like a 500 error or 503 error. I'm not really sure why, but what I do is I let it sit for about 5-10 seconds, and then I just click, I scroll back up to the top, I click dynamic DNS client, and what I'm looking for is a green cached IP over here. And as you can see on the bottom here, hatest.cloudautomation.blog does have my IP address, and if I go back to Cloudflare and I click F5, we'll see two things change. One is the content and the proxy status both updated. Hopefully. There we go. So we can see hatest has an IP address and is now proxied. So what we should be able to do now is possibly type hatest.cloudautomation.blog, invalid SSL cert. So we can see SSL is working here, it's working at Cloudflare, we're getting some type of error here. So what's going on? Okay, I had to take a little break there, and I watched some of the video and I realized half of my face is cut off. So we are back. We are now looking at hatest.cloudautomation.blog, and what we are seeing is a Cloudflare hosted website. It's saying that the browser is working, that Cloudflare is working, but Cloudflare is not getting a response from this domain, the actual host, hosting, let's say, a website or HomeAssistant. Now you might be thinking like, well, it says invalid SSL certificate, error 526. You could look this up and dig into it. Essentially, we haven't configured the host to receive a request from Cloudflare, so we're going to do that now. So what this is doing and what this is saying is, we're on this workstation. This workstation is reaching out to my router saying, hey, Mr. Router, Mrs. Router, I need to find hatest.cloudautomation.blog. It's sending it out to Cloudflare. It pulled the DNS. It's sending out to Cloudflare. Cloudflare is saying, hey, this domain name lives on this IP, and it just happened to be the exact same place that it came from. So it reroutes it back to the firewall and the router, and that's where we're getting this error, this Cloudflare invalid SSL certificate error. So what we are going to do now is jump back to PFSense. We're going to drill into under HAProxy, so services, HAProxy. I'm going to edit our current HTTPS front end. And one thing that took me about 3 hours of troubleshooting and searching, and someone did help me on Reddit, was typically your HTTPS front end is facing outward, right? It's facing out towards the WAN. So your public IP address. You have to also add your LAN IP address as 443. You have to listen internally, and I'll talk about that just in 1 second, why we have to do that. So you want to make sure that both LAN and WAN, or whatever your internal network is, mine is called LAN, are both listening on 443 and they're allowed. SSL offloading checked. We need this ACL here, IP whitelist. You can name it whatever you want. Drop down custom ACL, and the source is that LAN IP range. So mine's default 192.168.1.0/24. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add another ACL here called HA test host matches, and I just used host matches. There's various options, and it's going to be HA test dot cloud automation dot blog. And then the action, we're going to use Backend, and I have not configured it yet, so we'll just select HomeAssistant. But what we want here is HA test, and it also has to match this IP whitelist. And this is why we're listening on that internal LAN subnet of 192.168.1.0. If what we're allowing is essentially all of our 443 services to be listened by your router, but I only want this HA test to be accessible from my intranet, not the internet, just internally. So what we are doing is we're now saying when this request hits 443, whether through the LAN or the WAN, it needs to also match this ACL rule, IP_white_list, which is that subnet range that we just went over. We're also going to scroll down now to additional certificates. We're going to add that certificate that we created just a few minutes ago called, well, that's interesting, it's not here. So we'll just not do this step for right now. So we need to come over to the backend, create a backend for that Home Assistant. We're going to call it HA test. Serverless HA test at 168.1.58, port 8123. I'll leave these default for now. I'll do a basic check. Click save. Go back to Frontend. Edit this. Scroll down here where we selected the backend. We want HA test. So now what we need to do real quick is go back to ACME Certs. We're going to go to this HA test cert. It was successful when we issued the test cert. We're going to click the pencil to edit it. We're going to flip it to the production ACME account. Click save. We're going to reissue that. And in just 1 second here, I'll show you what I was talking about. It actually goes in, it communicates with your DNS provider. And in this case, I'm using Cloudflare. It goes in and actually updates the security token that it uses to create this certificate, which we'll see just in 1 second. And when I say it goes in, it goes into Cloudflare to add that text record. So yeah, there's a lot to read here, but essentially right here you can see getting web root domain for hatest.cloudautomation.blog, adding text value. So this is that challenge token, ACME challenge.hatest text record. It adds the record. It then removes the other old DNS records, the old challenge records. It then creates their certificate, and we now have a production Let's Encrypt certificate through ACME. So we should be able to go back to HAProxy, and we're going to scroll all the way towards the bottom and go additional certificates, and then add that HA test cert. So if it's still under the test cert, it looks like it's not showing up here. It needs to be under the production ACME configuration. So we're going to add that cert, click save, we're going to apply changes, and now let's see what we get. Internal server error. So why did it do this? If you recall, I put an ACL on this entry to only allow requests from the 192 dot network. So if I do a quick command and I do a NS lookup on HA test, you will see it's going out to, it looks like 2 IPv6 addresses and then 2 IPv4 DNS servers. So it's going out to the public internet, out to Cloudflare. If I jump over to this, it's essentially coming from my workstation through my router out to Cloudflare and then back in, and my firewall is going 500, like, you are not allowed. And how do we fix this? We have to take a couple steps. This is another thing I had to research, and I needed some help. It took me hours and hours to figure this out. We have to go over to services. We have to go to DNS resolver. We have to enable DNS resolver. So now your PFSense firewall, router, is now going to be a DNS resolver for your local intranet. You can research some of these options. I really didn't change too much, but at the bottom what you do have to change or add is a host override. So we're going to click add. The host is HATest. The domain is cloudautomation.blog, the IP address. So we need to route this request. What we're doing is we're putting in a DNS, essentially a host entry in Linux, to forward this request somewhere. So if something comes along through my router from hatest.cloudautomation.blog from an internal request, where should it go? Where should it should it intercept it? Should it let it continue to an external DNS server? In this case, we want to intercept it. We want to keep it on the intranet and not allow it to go out to the network. So what we want to do is have the workstation, the request go to the router, and then bounce right back to, let's say, a different server on a different subnet. Back here, what we're going to do is, how we do that is we redirect it back to the PFSense router, which is 192.168.1.1 in my case. So let's do that. Let's add that. We're going to call this one HATest, excuse me. Click Save. And now, if I click Apply Changes, just give it a second. Okay, so now if I do that exact same request, nslookup hatest.cloudautomation.blog, and I hit enter, it's now showing a local resolution. So now this should work. So this is where DNS, I'm glad this did this. This is where DNS gets a little funky. And it'll have you scratching your head for hours and hours trying to troubleshoot why isn't this working. So if I go to hatest.cloud, okay, so as I mentioned, this is why I'm creating this video. So I pulled up an incognito window. If you could do this in Firefox, you could do this in another browser, such as whatever, the Edge browser. I pulled up the same exact link, hatest.cloudautomation.blog, and I got a 400 bad request. Again, another head scratcher. Why are we getting this? So if we dive into the HomeAssistant documentation, see if I can find an example. Here we go. Trusted proxies. So within our configuration.yaml file, we need to set two fields. We need to set this this use x forwarded for equal to true, and we need to allow a couple of trusted proxies. Yeah, actually you can see right here, this is what we need to enable. So we're going to go back to PuTTY. So I did something wrong. I am not sure what is a part of the install. My Docker Compose looks good, my file system looks good. Not really sure, but essentially the problem I'm having is this configuration.yaml file should be the file that is being loaded as a part of the start when it starts HomeAssistant, but it's not working that way. So what I had to run is docker exec-it, the container name, and then bash or bin bash, whatever. If I just do an ls, you'll see here I actually renamed one of the old configuration.yaml file, and you can see the new one. The problem here is that every time that this container is restarted, this file is overwritten or recreated, or it could be. So this isn't the best way to do this. It should be stored locally on that persistent mount, but for some reason it's not reading that file. I don't really need to dig into that, because to prove my point of, if you have HomeAssistant already configured, running on Docker with your persistent mount configuration.yaml file working, perfect. But I can edit this one. So what I'm going to do is a quick VI on this. I'm going to scroll down, do an insert, jump back to this reverse proxy, copy this, paste it, 92.168.1.1, and this should work. So do a WQ, go back to HomeAssistant, go Developer Tools, check the config, looks good. Let's do a quick restart. And there we go. And we're in. So, as you can see, we are securely connected to hatest.cloudautomation.blog, only internal on our network. If I was to go outside of my network, so for example, I can do it on my phone right now, I should get that 500 error. So if I go on my phone, and what I'm essentially doing is this piece right up here on the right. So I'm coming through the internet, through my phone provider, hitting my ISP. Actually, it's going to go to Cloudflare first, and then to my ISP, to my router, and it should get squashed right here because of that source rule that I put in under the the front end piece. So if I turn off my Wi-Fi, now I'm connected to my cellular utility, And if I go to hatest.cloudautomation.blog, there we go, 500 there. Now if I come back and I flip my Wi-Fi on, give it a second to connect. I know you can't see this, but I'm doing a sanity check for myself, as should you. Okay, my Wi-Fi is back on. Yeah, worked perfectly, right with the login screen. The last thing I have to add, if this is not working for you, which it's a very good chance that it is not, is you have to set your computer or your PC or your phone's DNS servers as your router, that 192.168.1.1. This is why. If I go back here, if I'm on my phone and my DNS server is that quad 9, which is Cloudflare, when I request hatest.cloudautomation.blog, I'm going to reach all the way out here. I'm going to get that DNS server record, which is, or the website record from the DNS server, which is going to point back to my ISP and to my firewall. So essentially it's going to reach all the way out here, out to Cloudflare. It's going to come through and it's going to get squashed because of that source record. It's going to say, nope, you are not allowed. So what you need to do is set your router, which is now, I should put down here, also your DNS server, or at least your local DNS server, to where your mobile and your workstation, all these servers, use your router first as a primary DNS server, and then if it can't resolve it, it then passes it on to a secondary DNS server. And those two things can be configured on your mobile or on your workstation through static IP addresses. The way I have it set up is through my DHCP server running on my PFSense router. So on my DHCP server, I have my DNS servers as 192.168.1.1, and then on my router, which I can just pull up real quick, if I go to services and I go to DHCP server, if I scroll down, you will see DNS servers as 192.168.1.1. I am pointing to itself. So you go to System, you go to General Setup, and this is where you're going to set your DNS servers for the PFSense box. So if it can't resolve it locally, it will automatically route it to these other DNS servers, which are the Quad 9, and I use 1.1.1.1. What that allows you to then do, DHCP server is set on 192.168.1.1, and I request a local host override here. If you recall, we just set those host overrides, right? hatest.cloudautomation.blog. That is set here locally. What it's going to do is hairpin that request right back to me without going out to the internet. So I'm hitting my local DNS server, saying, hey, where's hatest.cloudautomation.blog? It's returning, well, hey, it lives right over here on this server. And if you recall, I put in that source rule, that source IP whitelist rule. So if my source is 192.168.1. let's say 100, it's going to allow list it to then contact this server, right? It's listening on that LAN 443 port. So it's listening on the WAN port as well, but also on the LAN. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful. As you can now see, we are on hatest.cloudautomation.blog. It is secure. You have a domain name. You have a certificate that will now refresh every, I think it's 60 days by default. You won't have to worry about that. If anyone has any questions, any comments, feel free to post a comment in the video. I will address it as quickly as possible. If I have to, if I missed anything, I can come back, I can edit this or create another video, and I appreciate any feedback. I know this was probably a little bit longer than I wanted and maybe longer than you wanted, but I do appreciate you watching, and again, any feedback. Thank you.